you do when something inside you refuses to stay quiet? Not a preference, not a desire, a need, the kind of need that wakes you up in the middle of the night and will not let you rest until it is answered. Jesus explores that question in one of his most overlooked parables, The Friend at Midnight. Jesus tells the story in Luke 11, verses 5 to 8, saying, quote, "Suppose one of you has a friend whom he goes at midnight and says, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived at my house from a journey, and I have nothing to offer him.' And he says in reply from within, 'Do not bother me. The door has already been locked, and my children and I are already in bed. I cannot get up to give you anything.' I tell you, if he does not get up to give him the loaves because of their friendship, he will get up to give him whatever he needs because of his persistence." On the surface, the parable appears to be about helping others even when it is inconvenient. But like all of Jesus' parables, it points to a deeper reality concerning the internal world of the human mind. The man knocking is the part of you that recognizes a need. The friend inside is the part of you that would rather remain comfortable than get up and respond. Yet every meaningful transformation begins with an inner knock, a truth that refuses to go away, a calling that keeps returning, a need that will not be silenced. That is the knock. The friend refuses to answer the knock. At least initially, the door remains closed. The answer does not come immediately, but the need remains. The knocking continues. Why? Because some lessons cannot be learned through instant gratification. Persistence develops capacities that immediate satisfaction never could. Persistence is how the deeper self gets the attention of the distracted self. This is the first critical insight of the parable. The knock begins when an internal need becomes undeniable. Yet Jesus will ultimately reveal that the deepest need is not the one the man recognizes. The need for bread may be what initiates the search in the story, but it is not where the story ends. The knocking represents more than a request for bread. It represents an inner signal that something essential is missing. We often imagine growth begins with inspiration. More often, though, it begins with insufficiency. We discover a gap between who we are and who the moment requires us to become, and that gap creates tension. The man in the parable eventually receives the bread he seeks. The door opens, the need is met, but only after persistence, only after the man refuses to retreat from the reality of his condition. And that may be the deepest lesson of all. Growth begins when we stop running from need and start listening to it. The kingdom Jesus describes is not built on avoidance, but on responsiveness. Need is acknowledged, and what is needed is provided. Perhaps the greatest mistake we make is assuming the knocking is the problem. Yet the discomfort and dissatisfaction we try to avoid are often invitations to transformation. Consider someone who has spent years building a successful life, only to discover a persistent sense that something is missing. At first, the feeling is dismissed, then ignored, yet it refuses to disappear. Eventually, it becomes clear that the knock is not anxiety, but truth. The life that was built can no longer nourish the person who is emerging. The guest has arrived, and the knocking will not stop until it is answered. Anyone who has pursued meaningful growth understands this experience of the knock not being answered. You ask for clarity, confusion remains. You seek direction, uncertainty persists. You desire transformation. Old patterns continue. It can feel like the door remains shut, but often what feels like rejection is actually preparation. The longer the knocking continues, the more obvious something becomes. The need is real, He cannot pretend the guest is not there. He cannot distract himself anymore. He cannot postpone the problem until tomorrow. The situation demands response. At this point, we would expect Jesus to explain how persistence leads to receiving what we want. Instead, he takes the story somewhere completely unexpected. First, let's analyze exactly what he says. He begins by saying, quote, "Ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened. What father among you would hand his son a snake when he asks for a fish, or hand him a scorpion when he asks for an egg?" Unquote. But here is where the teaching takes an unexpected turn when he finishes with, quote, "If you then, who are wicked, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will the Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?" Unquote. At first glance, it seems that the man is seeking bread, but Jesus ends by talking about the Holy Spirit. The focus shifts from what the man thinks he needs to what the Father truly desires to give him. Most of us approach this story assuming that persistence is about obtaining something we lack: more money, more clarity, more certainty, more answers. Yet Jesus suggests that beneath every request lies a deeper need, the need to awaken to a reality and truth that lies deeper than the identities we construct for ourselves. This realization is comparable to receiving what we ask for, finding what we seek, and having the door opened when we knock, because it restores our awareness of what has always been true. Psychologically, we might understand the Holy Spirit as the awakening of consciousness from the illusion of separation. It's the rediscovery of the deeper dimension of ourselves that remains connected to truth. In this sense, the Holy Spirit is not merely information or belief. It is the transformative force that dissolves denial, exposes illusion, confronts self-deception, and gradually aligns us with reality. This tendency to resist truth isn't new. It appears at the very beginning of the biblical story. Think back to the story of Adam and Eve. When truth becomes uncomfortable, they hide. When accountability arrives, they blame. When reality confronts them in the form of God, they defend themselves. Adam blames Eve, and Eve blames the serpent. The pattern is familiar because it still lives within us. We hide from what we do not want to see. We rationalize what we do not want to face, and we protect identities that no longer serve us. The Holy Spirit, understood as our consciousness of the false and the true, moves in opposite directions. Where Adam hides, truth reveals. Where Eve blames, truth convicts. Where Adam defends the false self, truth calls forth the authentic self. The bread in the parable represents the immediate need that drives us to knock. The Holy Spirit represents what we discover when the door finally opens, the truth that was present all along, waiting to be recognized. In closing, The Friend at Midnight reveals the moment when need becomes undeniable, the moment when the mind can no longer avoid what it knows. The bread in the story was merely the catalyst, but the awakening to truth was the real gift. The rich fool asked what happens when prosperity causes us to forget our need. The Friend at Midnight asks what happens when we can no longer ignore our need. In our final video of the Perception Parable series, we will explore the parable of the watchful servants, which reveals what happens when perception is fully awake, when the self lives in a state of readiness, attunement, alignment, and quiet vigilance, rather than denial, distraction, blame, or fear. See you there. Thanks for watching.